Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 1st of March 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson.
Afternoon.
Well, it's a bit cold, chilly, grey. Was raining, brightening slightly in Plymouth. We think that the prize goes to Pembrokeshire, where apparently there's sun, and there has been a sudden outpouring of corgis who are all there amongst the daffodils. So if you're in the Pembrokeshire area of Wales, you're clearly doing very well today. Manchester is just described as damp. So pretty gloomy stuff in Manchester, which is ideal for the referendum, Mike, I suppose.
But we're starting with warm weather.
Of course, global warming, climate change.
Allegedly. So apparently this winter was the warmest ever in England and Wales. It has been pretty warm and wet in Plymouth anyway, in general, a bit colder in the last few weeks. But this is the Met Office who are crowing about temperatures beating all previous records, including those set in 2007 and 1989. And I didn't really want to say any more about this other than this article. There's no mention of the words El Nino, which of course is what's driving this warm airstream that we're getting at the moment. And is El Nino anything to do with global warming? I don't think it is.
I wouldn't have thought so, but who knows what they're up to at the moment. But there we are, the weather is changeable. A bit like the political situation at the moment, very confused, and many people are saying to us what is going on because there's so much appearing in the public domain. Well, one thing people haven't missed is Theresa May, and as the Mail article here says, Theresa May accused of exploiting the EU campaign to sneak the Snoopers Charter into law while MPs are distracted. These MPs, Mike, are just so naive that one little bit of publicity in one area, they will forget what they're looking at, and in comes Reaper, and we've got a state spying on us like, never before seen.
Well, the key thing about the Snoopers Charter is that it's an attempt to retrospectively legalise stuff that's been going on for quite a number of years. There's not really much else to say about that, is there?
Except it's obvious, but not to MPs. A little bit later in the news, we'll probably discover why it's so difficult for MPs to understand these sorts of things, and we'll just be taking a little peek at local Conservative MP, Mr. Colville.
But let's just talk a little bit more about the Snoopers Charter because I chose that image. It seemed to be suitable. So she's trying to sneak this through, as you say, but they are announcing the revised plans today, the revised powers for UK police and security services. And these, of course, are the response to what is all the criticism that they've had. So let's have a look at that. There's going to be 6 codes of practice on the use of the Snoopers Charter. There are going to be allegedly stronger privacy safeguards. It hasn't really been identified what those are yet. We haven't seen the final document yet. Apparently, there's going to be a double lock on ministerial warrants, and this double lock is going to come in the form of a judicial commissioner. So whenever a minister wants to issue a warrant, probably one typical use for this might be to ask for foreign intelligence organisations to undertake surveillance activity on GCHQ's behalf, for example. So that is where the double lock would come in. It would require approval by the Secretary of State and a judicial commissioner. They're describing it as a pragmatic approach to encryption, and they're saying that this pragmatic approach is going to keep Apple happy. Well, I'm not sure how you have a pragmatic approach to a backdoor. Either there's a backdoor in your encryption or there isn't. And I don't see how any sort of watering down is going to keep Apple happy. And there's going to be shorter time allowance for urgent warrants. So this is the length of time that they're allowed to snoop on you in the case of an urgent warrant. And they are going to reduce that time, I think, from 5 days to 3 days. So that's all right then. The Home Office, as I say, has said that this new legislation, this new proposal, will address concerns expressed by Apple and other tech giants. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's more of the same language, Mike. They are bringing in a police state, and these reassurances that a minister is going to approve it, and we've got some judicial commissioner, well, this system doesn't work, does it? And we see time and time again that when they do as they please and somebody complains, you are then locked into the never-ending circle of a complaints procedure. Yeah. So I believe it's a scam and a lie while they bring in more of a police state.
And of course, part and parcel of that police state was their independent review on freedom of information. And unfortunately for them, they don't seem to have managed to get this through because there was such a backlash from the public that they seem to have chickened out of it. Is that a fair statement? There will be no legal changes, apparently, to the freedom of information legislation after reviewing the Act. Here's the man himself, Matt Hancock. He organised this review. He said that he was pledging to encourage transparency in the public sector. He said that after 10 years, we took the decision to review the Freedom of Information Act, and we found it is working well, apparently. So that's all very good.
That's because they're not answering in most of the cases. They don't bother to answer as required with freedom of information.
Indeed. So Hancock said, this government is committed to making government more transparent so taxpayers can hold the state to account, both on how their money is being spent and how decisions are made which affect their lives. So let's see, what have they said here? So they haven't answered all the Commission's recommendations, but some of them they have. So with regard to charging for freedom of information requests, which is one thing that they were going to attempt to do, they have said the government agrees, this is all coming out of the Cabinet Office, by the way, the government agrees with the Commission's view that it is not appropriate to introduce fees for requests over and above the existing narrow circumstances in which a requester can be currently charged for disbursement costs. And then one thing that a lot of people perhaps don't realise is that there is a cabinet veto on the issuance of answers. And in this case, they say the cabinet recommends the introduction of a narrower and more limited veto provision. The government agrees with the Commission's analysis that Parliament intended the executive to be able to have the final say as to whether information should be released under the Act. In line with the Commission's thinking, the government will in future only deploy the veto after an Information Commissioner decision. On the basis that this approach proves effective, we will not bring forward legislation at this stage. It could be legislated for later. And then the other one that, in particular, that I wanted to highlight was handling vexatious requests. The Commission recognises the difficulty that genuinely vexatious requests can place on public authorities. I'd like to understand their definition of a genuinely vexatious request, because in some cases it's simply people are labelled vexatious because they're not getting the relevant answer from the public body. And he goes on to say, we agree with the recommendations of improved guidance via a revised code of practice to allow public authorities to use the section 14.1 in the rare cases where it's necessary and appropriate. The exercise by citizens of legal rights also brings with it responsibilities, and access to information rights should not be abused to cause distress or means of harassment. So there you go. That's what they're talking about.
And of course, as more things get privatised, Mike, they can sidestep the freedom of information request system anyway. Although where there's a contract so that public sector services have gone straight to a private supplier, freedom of information rules should still apply to that private contractor. In principle, they're simply ignoring the request.
Well, right. So every time a private corporation ends up with a freedom of information request, they refuse to answer it, and then unless that's really pressed through the Information Commissioner, you're not likely to get a response.
At all. Which is transparency, which started, of course, under Francis Maude, who just happened to be the man in post when Common Purpose was doing its dirty little backroom training deals through the Cabinet Office. Well, let's move on to, let's move on to the referendum. And we received this very interesting email, which I'd like to read out because it's so good. Dear Sir, as a teenager, I worked on the Keep Britain in Europe campaign for Ted Heath. I was conned and I lied to the British people on behalf of a bunch of corrupt people. I'm now 59 and a committed out of the EU supporter. I've researched the net and read and watched reports of the goings on within the EU Commission. and on its behalf in the UK. Having watched a lot of your clips on the internet, things happening around me make a lot more sense. I've worked in China for 12 years, hence I can see a huge change in the UK's morality in all areas of society on my return. A common purpose still alive and doing their dirty deeds for Europe. Why do the Out campaign not expose what is happening and use it to engage the British people to end this silent war with a referendum? I'm a Geordie. We voted no to a local mayor and all that goes with it. It is still going ahead against the wishes of the local people. It's similar to the Cunningham era in the northwest, where whole areas were demolished and rebuilt by corruption, putting millions into the pockets of the corrupt. Cunningham ended up in jail, thank God. This time, however, there seems to be no law to stop anything. His son is back on the bandwagon. Very best regards, David. Well, that really says it all, that somebody was conned in the Ted Heath era with going into the European Economic Community. We were told it was trade. In fact, it's a superstate. But the other questions there, why have we got this breakdown in UK? That is because, as Eric Pickles, Tory minister, says, he's involved in revolution. And before you can build the new EU superstate, you have to destroy the old society. So the answer to that email is this Tory party is hell-bent on destroying UK from the inside, led by Mr Cameron, of course, who's prepared to say anything to anyone to get his way.
Well, indeed, I wasn't going to say too much about the EU referendum today, but I did want to highlight this article in the Telegraph. The Prime Minister is entitled to back EU membership. They say this is an opinion piece, but his tactics are cause for growing concern. And they say at the referendum due in June, the official policy of David Cameron's government is that Britain should adopt to remain a member of the European Union. There is no dishonour in that position, which is openly stated. The electorate will, in due course, be able to pass judgment on the government for it. However, the way in which the government is acting in pursuit of that policy is a cause for growing concern, and they go on to discuss the whole fear aspect of this. And they end up by saying the Prime Minister should think again about preventing ministers who seek to leave the EU seeing government papers on this issue. Not only does that stricture impede the ordinary business of governing, it further adds to the impression of a Prime Minister fearful of losing ground in the referendum battle and willing to take even desperate measures to win. So they highlight some interesting points, but of course they don't quite get to grips with why this referendum is totally chaotic. And perhaps if anybody didn't see our programme yesterday, you might have a look at it, and that perhaps will give you a clue. But in the meantime, of course, the markets, in inverted commas, continue to punish the UK. And what we've got here is an article highlighting that the UK gilts, this is UK debt being sold on the markets, are pretty unpopular at the moment. Nobody is wanting to buy them. Now, one of the interesting statistics out of this little article here is the fact that the government is required to raise £10 billion a month in order to from international markets in order to fund the so-called budget deficit and keep the government running. £10 billion a month, and they're not really selling any gilts at the moment, so it's looking like there may possibly be what the FT is describing as a rare failed auction. So
does this mean we're bankrupt, Mike?
No, it just means that the markets are hinting that perhaps we should stay in, because unless we do, they're not going to give us any money, and if we don't get any money, then the government can't function. So it's a question of servicing debt, isn't it? Well, they shouldn't be taking this approach in the first place, in my opinion, but others may have different views.
Well, let's take the subject of money and bring it down to a local level, and what better place to start than Plymouth? Here's the headline from the Plymouth Herald. Council tax bills will rise this year in Plymouth as councillors approve budget in heated meeting. I encourage people to go to the Herald site and read this really excellent report. This is just a bit of it. It says the rise will bring in 1.8 million for the council, 33% of the required cut to adult social care, with the money ring-fenced to keep vulnerable elderly people in their own homes or provide supported housing for adults with complex needs. So there you've got it. There's the pull on the heartstrings. We're going to tax you more in order to help these elderly people and help the care system. But the reality is these people are absolutely at each other's throats as a result of the international banking cartel's lie that there is no money. Mike, you've really just touched on part of that. But it's ironic that we're hearing some very interesting accusations that Plymouth Social Services are actually attempting to take away the property from elderly people. So
they wouldn't do that, would they?
Well, I have to say it appears that they are doing exactly that, so that when people are ill or they require some form of care, the first thing that happens is a charge is placed on their house, and then it would appear that social services manoeuvre in position to take their homes. If that's being reported in Plymouth, it's also being reported from other locations across UK. So we think on the back of the lie, there is no money, there's a particularly unpleasant social agenda at work. But let's hop across to Vote Leave. Here's the website. We don't trust this website at all on the basis that it's a false site, in our opinion, leading people towards a vote out, but they don't really mean that at all. However, we did take up on their figure on the screen, which is a mere £506 billion. This is apparently the amount that we've paid into the EU to date. And if you watch the website, you see this, which is it clocking up literally every second. So in Plymouth, we have councillors at each other's throats that there is no money to care for the elderly, vulnerable and sick. But the reality, of course, is that both Labour, Lib Dem and the Tories are pumping our money into what is a fraudulent and corrupt European Union. Any better in Moscow, Mike?
Well, I was fascinated by this story. This is the Russia Health Service in Omsk. And what are they saying here? A 69-year-old woman has died in a hospital in the Siberian city of Omsk after she was forced to spend 3 hours in a queue waiting to be seen by a doctor. And my first reaction to this was that British people would die for a health service that they only have to wait 3 hours in a queue to attend. And so this is Omsk in Siberia, sort of the outer reaches of the Russian Empire, and and they're worried about waiting for 3 hours in a queue.
I'd also say from that picture, it all looks pretty clean and tidy inside.
So there's now going to be an investigation by the Prosecutor's General Office. So they're carrying out an investigation into the incident. So, you know, we should be ashamed of the state of our NHS at the moment, which of course is not the fault of the doctors and the nurses and is purely the fault of policy and management and the common purpose. But I also wanted to highlight this because it was in the Mail, but it was in a number of other places. It was on the BBC Today programme this morning. Towns that make you live longer. NHS plans estates with anti-trip pavements and fewer takeaways. And what have we got here? Instead of the National Health Service concentrating on treating people's health, they're getting into property development. And so what they're going to build is 10 new housing estates. The one that is highlighted in the Mail article here says that it will eventually look after 170,000 people. And it's basically a lab experiment. What they're doing here is they're going to trial a range of different measures. So this is an experiment. They're going to look at people's behavior based on, for example, how far away fast food takeaway outlets are to schools, how much land is set aside for outdoor activities and this sort of thing, encouraging people to walk rather than drive. This is a massive behavioural experiment, massive on a scale we haven't seen before, and this is the NHS.
And of course, it's
organising it.
Sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead.
Of course, it's an NHS, which is a gnat's whisker from being fully privatised. So this won't be the public sector NHS running this lot. It's effectively going to be private corporations.
That's right. So this is being pushed forward by the Chief Executive of NHS England and Wales. And what did he have to say? it's going to be. Sorry, he will describe apparently later on today this housing experiment as a golden opportunity for the NHS to help promote health and keep people independent. He said he will say, we want children to have places where they want to play with friends and can safely walk and cycle to school rather than just exercising their fingers on video games. Well, at first glance, that might seem like a laudable thing, but this isn't particularly the way to do it.
Oh, we just remember that video game comment, Mike, because I have something which links in very nicely. So the NHS is going to build our cities, maintain the pavements, and make sure the children don't get involved with video games.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, tonight, reminder, in Frome, the Saving Syrian Children, Syria's Children documentary, the critique of that by Robert Stewart, who has done so much fantastic research into how this documentary was put together, the timing of it, and so on. It's in the Wheat Sheaves, Bath Street, Frome, begins at 7:30, £3 entrance. Please get along to it if you can. It's going to be hugely interesting. Brian and I will be there, and Theo as well.
Indeed. Well, that brings us very nicely to our illustrious King, King David, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and here he is. What has he been up to? Well, this is a really telling article in the Telegraph. Secret plans to axe 90% of Tory associations, which would help smooth the way for George Osborne's coronation as leader. Well, the George Osborne bid is a bit of a smokescreen in itself, because what is going to happen is a massive cutback, a massive attack on the associations, which is really the heart of the Tory party, and the public getting involved with the party. So under the new plans, Tory associations will be merged into between 60 and 70 multi-constituency associations based loosely on county areas. I'm going to predict now, of course, it won't be county areas, it will be regions. And the super associations will employ permanent party staff. So the local association chairmen who know people on the ground, know their communities, they're going to go and they're going to be replaced by centralised party staff. This is the Stalinist state coming in, Mike. So the party's membership list will be run centrally from Conservative Central Office, further cutting out the traditional role of the chairman and allowing the leadership to communicate directly with members.
Is that the big society where the king in the centre communicates with everybody right down to the coalface?
Indeed. I would say communicate really means control, but they've used the word communicate. We just thought we'd remind people a little bit about David Cameron. This was David Cameron, who basically told his MPs to ignore the views of Eurosceptic grassroots members. You don't want to pay attention to the associations because they've got their finger on the button. They know the European Union is rotten. So what does Cameron say? Ignore them. How can he say that? Because he knew that the next step was to get rid of the Conservative associations. And we better remind people, of course, that David Cameron has said that his loyalty isn't to this country anyway. His loyalty to Israel is unshakable. So by the time this system's come in place, it presumably will be Israel that will be running the Tory party. I may be a bit cynical there, but we'll also remind you that if you dare to criticise, maybe it's going to get a bit dangerous, because of course we showed a few days ago that the chairman of Cameron's Witney constituency, who wrote a very revealing report exposing the rot in the Tory party, was found dead a mere 20 hours later. So that's what's coming, and there's no secret about it. The Telegraph is bringing it into the public domain very nicely. This was a fascinating email from a gentleman who says that the situation mirrors what was happening with the Esperanto Association of Britain when they cut off the regional federations and distanced the local clubs. And at the heart of this email is they were able to do this because they had money coming in from different directions. They didn't need people on the ground, so they didn't really care what was going to happen. And so the local membership was cut out, And the email here ends, the Cameronites, I think, are in the same position. They don't need members any longer, and they must be scared stiff of a repeat of the Corbyn factor. Dictatorship in the ruling party means dictatorship in the country. This couldn't be more obvious, Mike, could it?
Indeed.
Right, how is the EU destroying this country? Well, let's come to the heart of the Southwest. I think we've covered this organisation before, but this is one of the massive networks which simply is there in order to feed off European money. Go and have a look at the site yourself. It says, as the country debates European membership, we continue to strive for the best possible deals for our area. Currently, we're gearing up for our anticipated role to provide technical assistance to new applicants for European funding. So this whole thing is a begging bowl from the European Union, and as you will see in a minute, it links together a whole raft of people in the Southwest. But we mentioned video games. This is part of their site where they're boasting about funding streams for the creative, digital and design community. And have a look at this, because Creative Europe is the European Union's programme to support the cultural, creative and audiovisual sectors. And from 2014 to 2020, they've got a mere 1.46 billion to support projects, which, as you read at the bottom, includes film, television, new media and games. So I wonder whether the NHS should be getting in there and closing down Heart of the Southwest on the basis that Heart of the Southwest appears to be bad for your mind. 1.46 billion, but there's no money to care for needy people. Have a look at this organisation yourself. It's very glossy, but everything is to do with feeding off European money, much of which has come from us in the first place. And of course, it's about devolution and regionalisation. So this is this is EU centralised policy. And the best way for me to show you people involved, bear with me, it's a little bit slow, but this is a pernicious mix of corporatists, accountants, local authority people who are all in a giant club in order to beg from the European Union. And of course, once they're taking the European Union euro, they are completely owned. So as the public tries to decide on coming out of Europe, these people will be in the background. And here's our very own Tudor Evans, Labour leader from Plymouth City Council. So he's happy to give money to the European Union while he sits in the debating chamber saying they can't look after people in care. Have a look yourselves. It's an extraordinary mix of people. I think we'll leave it there, feeding off EU money. And while that's going on, of course, British Armed Forces are being cut to the bone. There's been several reports on this. Part of it has achieved an early reach of the targets for redundancy, so the armed forces being decimated. Some reasonable statistics for the BBC here showing the army down to just over 80,000, which is not viable in any significant conflict. We now know why this is being done, because through the back door, David Cameron has accepted European policy for what is known as acceptable merger rates within the pan-European Union military. So what they're doing is cutting back the ones that are too strong, such as British military forces, so that they can be fully integrated with the European military. And these are the elements coming very quickly. The EU Treasury, which you've mentioned, Mike, EU military and EU superstate. None of our MPs can understand this, of course. Here's the reason why. Meet Oliver Colville. This man, for months, believes that the most important issue in this country is the plight of hedgehogs.
I suspect we're about to find out why, because maybe he was channeling some money to the hedgehogs or something, I don't know. But he has been named as one of 24 Tory MPs who didn't declare thousands of pounds worth of election expenses. In his case, it was with regard to his campaigning on his battle bus. £2,000 a day is what he was paying for renting the bus, paying expenses for volunteers. It's quite an interesting little statistic in this article as well, because apparently one particular Tory activist was invoicing the Tory party £1,060 a day for a time campaigning with Oliver Colville, and that was over 10 days.
Well, he probably needed somebody with that expertise, Mike, because, of course, his vocabulary a little bit limited. Hedgehogs and not so good on state of the nation.
Indeed. So the Mirror, according to the Herald here, says that Mr. Colville didn't declare money spent on the bus, hotels or food. I mean, that's got to be simple corruption, no? Particularly in an election time when every penny is supposed to be accounted for in order to guarantee fairness between the candidates.
Well, I don't think politicians call it that, Mike. I think normally it's an accounting error, it's an oversight, or it's somebody else's fault.
Right.
There we go. Syria, probably.
Yes, Syria. Well, the ceasefire is still in place despite all the allegations that it isn't. But Sunday night saw a telephone call between Lavrov and John Kerry discussing the ceasefire, and they were mainly discussing how they might work together because, of course, the Syrian government and the Russians have said that they want to keep the pressure on ISIS and on the al-Nusra front. So they discussed coordinating approaches to the UN Security Council resolution, which was, this is a separate thing aimed at North Korea as well. So they had a good conversation apparently. But with regard to Syria, it's pretty clear that the ceasefire is mainly holding at the moment. This seems to be the pressures that are operating within ISIS seem to be boiling over. So one headline that I saw was pointing out that 8 Netherlanders who were working with ISIS recently were beheaded in the last couple of days because they were trying to escape. So I guess they were trying to take advantage of the ceasefire to get out. They got caught, they got their heads cut off. So that's 8 out of apparently 200 people from the Netherlands fighting in Syria and Iraq. It didn't stop, however, according to Global Research, and no reason to. I mean, this is another good article from them. It didn't stop some of the UN humanitarian aid, which has been going in during this ceasefire time, accidentally landing in ISIS-controlled territory in Deir ez-Zor. So they're saying here the UN World Food Programme aid for the restricted Syrian civilians in Deir ez-Zor have landed mostly in ISIS-controlled territories, a source in the city's administration said on Thursday. Planes dropped the humanitarian help sent by the United Nations into territory controlled by Daesh. Just 2 containers ended up in the areas where the Syrian army is located, and that was according to RIA Novosti. So they're doing a good job there.
Well, I can't really understand it, Mike, because, of course, we're being told at the moment that technology, precision weapons, precision navigation systems means that we can pick out individual terrorists in Syria to be taken out by drone strikes, but apparently we can't drop supplies in roughly the right area. Apparently. Well, we better end on this gentleman. Here he is, Tony Blair. A book has come out called Broken Vows, which is really beginning to put the spotlight back on Tony Blair. And in particular, the book is saying this man simply did not tell the truth to people around him, senior Whitehall officials, and in particular, senior military staff. Well, not much of a surprise there. But the other thing in this article, which is of great interest, is it suggests that the Chilcot inquiry report will be released very shortly. So that would be good timing to keep people's attention off the EU referendum, Mike.
Amazing timing.
Amazing. What a coincidence. Well, there we are. Could we put it in any plainer words? UK at the moment is being taken apart. How is it being taken apart? It's being taken apart because all of the public institutions which should be there running the country and protecting us have been corrupted, infiltrated, corrupted, and simply dismantled. Who is doing it? Well, there's only one answer to that. The political party in power, the Conservatives, led by David Cameron, the man who's pledged his allegiance not to Britain, but to a foreign country, including the EU superstate. If we want to stop it, we need to explain what's happening to people. We need to expose the truth, and we need to challenge MPs who clearly are beginning, I think, to drop out of the real world. And saying that, of course, I have Mr. Oliver Colville in mind. That's it for us today. We'll be back same time tomorrow, and we'll be joined by Alex
Thompson.
Alex Thompson from the Netherlands. Okay, see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.